Good evening. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Paradox of Sovereignty and Global Migration. My name is Benjamin McLean, and I'm a member of this year's EPIIC class. I'm a sophomore at Tufts studying quantitative economics, and I will be the moderator for this evening's panel. I find it very fitting that this follows the keynote by His Excellency, Mr. Miroslav Lajcek. After all, a large part of Mr. Lajcek's legacy was the Global Compact for Migration, which is an example of what can happen when the global community comes together to discuss the problems facing migration in today's world. After the adoption of the Global Compact in Marrakesh in December, Canadian Ambassador Marc-André Blanchard spoke out in favor of it, saying, "We must find ways to harness the opportunities migration presents and to address the challenges." He continues, "Today, we have an opportunity to begin working together." Meanwhile, the only country to share a land border with Canada, the United States, has been outspoken against the GCM. The Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration stressed how the compact infringes upon national sovereignty. We cannot support a compact or process that imposes or has the potential to impose our ability to make decisions in the best interests of our nation. Let me make clear that the GCM is not the only contentious matter concerning migration and national sovereignty. Hungary has also been a large proponent of following its own policies, going so far as to ignore EU regulations and construct a border wall. Despite outside pressure, Australia maintains its policies aimed at deterring illegal migration, no matter how draconian they may be. The conflict between national policy and migration is a problem that every nation must face. James Hampshire, in his book, The Politics of Immigration, says, "The liberal states Janus face towards immigration is not something that can be washed away. Liberal states are unavoidably characterized by degrees of openness towards some types of immigration and degrees of closure towards them. The question then becomes one of explaining the dynamics that shape these apparently paradoxical tendencies." It was with this question in mind that my classmates and I decided to create the Paradox of Sovereignty and Global Migration panel for this year's symposium. We hope that through dialogue, this panel will help provide answers as well as prompt deeper thinking about whether or not migration is black and white when it comes to international cooperation. I would like to go over the structure of this panel before we begin. I'll introduce each of our three panelists, after which they will do their own opening remarks. After everyone has given their opening remarks, we will then ask the panelists if they have any questions or comments about each other's, after which we will open it up to questions from the audience. We hope to keep this a very fun evening, as well as get you all out on time so that you may enjoy your Friday night. With that being said, let us get started. Let me please introduce our first panelist of the evening, Dr. Liev Orgod. Dr. Orgod is the head of the Project Group International Citizenship Law at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center, director of the research group Global Citizenship Governance at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, the European University Institute, and an associate professor of the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy, Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya. He is the author of The Cultural Defense of Nations, a liberal theory of majority rights. Please welcome Dr. Liev Orgod.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here among the future generation of leaders, and greetings everyone. I want to present several causes, 10 to be more accurate, for why migration has become associated with the global crisis. And this, I hope, will provide a discussion with a global and theoretical perspective. Now, understanding these causes or reasons is critical to govern global migration, but also to turn it from a crisis to an opportunity. So the 10 reasons are related to fundamental changes in the patterns of migration in Western societies and in the world as a whole. Let me start with migration. I have more or less 1 minute for each reason. So first, numbers. Look, the world is on the move. There were 260 million international migrants last year in 2018, 68 million forcibly displaced people last year, 50 million irregular migrants, and 740 million internal migrants. So it's more or less 1 billion people on the move. Now, while it is true, and some people mentioned that today, that the percentage of migrants has not changed much since the 60s, the percentage of migrants among the global population, it is 7 times higher in the developed world than in the developing world, as you can see here in the table. Now, at the regional level, if you zoom in into a specific region, migration has almost tripled. In Europe, from 3% in the 50s to 10 or 11% today, and doubled in North America. On the national level, as you can see here, the data, the changes are much more radical. You can see here Denmark, Italy, and Spain, but I think the data is more or less the same in other European societies. Really a dramatic change from the 60s to today, and I think it's undisputed that all demographic predictions show that immigration will continue to grow in the near futures. So numbers. Second reason is the composition of migration, or the character, if you want. Now, in some countries, immigrants are coming from societies with a fundamentally, really radically different culture, often different religion of the majority population. It's not necessarily bad or good, it's just a fact. In Europe, when you exclude intra-European movements, those who move from one European state to another, 39% of total migration to the Union includes people of Muslim faith. Now, in addition, and this is not less important, until recent decades, global migration was mainly about labor workers. Today, however, more than 50% of the global migrants are family migration rather than labor migration. And why it makes a difference? For many reasons. Family migration is usually not temporary. It is more difficult to restrict because citizens have a right to family life. It is likely to increase migration, and most importantly, it is not so discretionary. So countries don't really select family migrants based on merits or skills. They arrive on the basis of legal entitlement. So numbers, composition. Third reason, intensity. It's not just too many, too different, but also too fast. There is really a hyper-migration of mass movement of people at a very short period of time, which in the past usually occurred as a consequence, as a result of wars or colonialism. In Europe, particularly, in the last 5 decades, the member states have become turned from countries of emigration, sending immigrants to the so-called New World, Australia, the United States, Canada, to immigrants receiving societies of a large scale. And while data doesn't support the popular claim that Muslims are likely to become a majority in Europe, taking over all these popular claims, that's completely fake news. As you can see here, Muslims will become a substantial minority in some member states, Austria, Belgium, Britain, France, and Sweden. Now, in the United States, the demographic changes are not less dramatic, even though much less visible. You know it better than me, the statistics. Americans are expected to be, white Americans are expected to be the minority in 2050, actually a few years before. In contrast, Hispanic Americans, a tiny minority in the 60s, as you can see here, are expected to reach 30% of the population in 2050. Now, this is not a negative development. Diversity is mostly a positive development. But we have to understand that because you can imagine that this fast-changing reality generates what I call moral panic or demographobia in Western societies and kind of cultural anxieties. So numbers, composition, intensity. Fourth reason is related to the fact that immigration has somehow become associated with security and the cultural challenges. There is a growing body of literature on the cultural gap between the immigrants and the local communities, particularly in Europe, and on different issues: liberal values, free speech, gays' rights, gender equality, the legitimacy of the use of violence in resolving political conflict, the role of religion in the public sphere. But what is fascinating in Europe is that sometimes the gaps, those cultural gaps, are wider in the second and the third generation compared to the first generation. So there is a kind of an integration in reverse, if you want, and there are cases in which the gaps, those cultural gaps, especially on liberal values and principles and institutions, are wider in the third generation compared to the second, compared to the first. And in addition, social riots and terrorist acts they have made the issue of immigration more central and more visible. Now, the changing pattern of immigration, those four reasons, numbers, composition, intensity, and outcome, are only one side of the story. Here is another side, the changing face of Western societies. So the fifth reason is related to the so-called Western demographic crisis. In almost all Western countries, the total fertility rate is the number of children that a woman bears over a lifetime. So the total fertility rate has dropped below the replacement rate, meaning below 2.1, which is the fertility rate required for demographic stability. Now, why should we care? Why it's relevant to our topic? It's relevant because low fertility rates combined with high life expectancy affect the so-called old, as you can see it here, the old age support ratio, which measures the number of people of working age in relation to the number of people of retirement age. And some states have already reached the point in which the elderly, the old people, will outnumber the young. Japan, Italy, and Spain are just examples. And this means, and that's the important thing, fewer people of working age and more people in need of welfare stipends, pensions, and healthcare. So in fact, if liberal states want to preserve, to protect the welfare societies, the welfare systems, immigration is just a necessity. It's inevitable. 6, there is also identity crisis in the West. In the post-World War II international system, Western countries didn't need to set boundaries to their identity. I mean, national identity was kind of a given, not something that needs to be defined. But time of change, immigration, together with globalization and other forces, have led to a reality in which it becomes more difficult to know what it means to have a national identity. We are, I think, witnessing a fascinating phenomenon, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, in which countries try to protect their unique national identity, Britishness, Frenchness, Dutchness, those specific particular things that distinguish the here from there, but cannot clearly define what does it mean. I mean, in Britain, there was a government committee to define Britishness. There are some other attempts in France, in Spain, in European societies to define national identity, and they end up with, at most, a kind of local version of political liberalism. I think the very idea of searching a national identity is probably the clearest indicator of its devaluation. So in this context, the newcomers arrive into societies, Western societies, which are insecure or less secure about the essence of their national identity. Here you can see some of those books, handbooks of how to be British, how to be French, how to be German. There are all of them. Some of them are official books written by government committees, not these 3 those. Okay, so demographic crisis, identity crisis. The seventh reason relates to multiculturalism. Now, at the early stage of multiculturalism, there was a clear distinction between national minorities, which were supposed to be granted cultural group right, and immigrant groups, which were accepted to be integrated in the host societies. But this proposition no longer reflects described reality. Cultural group rights, demand for linguistic rights or exemption from general laws, originally developed for national minorities, are demanded nowadays, particularly again in Europe, by immigrants. I think that multiculturalism is also based on some false assumption. I'll give you two examples. It has failed to distinguish between illiberal minorities and anti-liberal minorities. Illiberal minorities in the sense that those groups which do not seek to change the liberal way of life of the society, the Amish in the United States. While anti-liberal minorities seek to use their political power to change the way of life, not only within their group, but also of the others. And in addition, the very idea that cultures are equal is logically problematic. And this is because there are cultures that do not recognize the idea that all cultures, or even all individuals, are equal. And therefore, the existence of multiculturalism, therefore, depends on the premise that the dominant culture will be the one which recognizes the idea of that all cultures are equal. Okay, so I mentioned migration, number, composition, rate, and outcome. I mentioned the Western societies, the changes in Western society, demographic crisis, identity crisis, and the rise of multiculturalism. Very briefly, 3 global transitions. 8th reason relates to geopolitical changes. This is the global population. You know, the global population in the last 200 years has dramatically grown from 1 billion at the beginning of the 19th century to almost 8 billion today. So 8 times more in 200 years. But this profound growth has mainly occurred in the developing countries, India, China, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Indonesia. Look what's going on in Europe. The European population declined from 25% of the global population at the beginning of the 20th century to 12% in 2000. And if current trends continue, only 7% of the world population will remain European by 2050. Geopolitics is changing not only geographically, but also religiously. Muslims made up 20% of the world population just 3 decades ago, 1990. And according to a Pew Research Center studies, in 2030, a decade from now, nearly 3 out of 10 children of the world will be Muslims. Again, those are just facts. I'm not saying bad or good. I'm happy to discuss it during the Q&A and to show you how it generates really moral panic. And I think some of those data are misused by right-wing movement. But in the meantime, I just want to present those causes, root causes, as the minister mentioned before, for the global migration crisis. 9 reasons globalization. People can live today in one country while retaining very close ties with another countries. You all know that distances are becoming shorter, moving costs are becoming lower. So the globalization generates really a high number of people on the move. Last year, there were 1.5 billion international boarding crossing in a year. Globalization creates another challenge. In today's world, the other is present, not just physically, but also spiritually. And it literally means that even if the state can control the flow of peoples, it can hardly control the flow of ideas and cultures. Last reason, 10, digitalization. Emerging technologies challenge democratic institutions, remodel also the essence of sovereignty, and change the way we think of borders and boundaries. Now, these changes occur regardless of migration. It has nothing to do necessarily with migration. However, migrants are often unjustly blamed for the negative effect of the digital revolution, and migration has become, if you want, the kind of the axis, the Pandora box for contemporary dilemmas in the liberal states. So to conclude, those are 10 reasons. I can go on. I don't have time. But I think that some people could justly say that the current situation is not historically unique. And I often hear that. Maybe. I think that if we single out each of these changes, we might find historical precedent for each. But the combination of all of them at one point in history, at a very short period of time, creates what we started the discussion, what we call the global migration crisis. Now, at the center of the issues are human rights. Those tragic stories of thousands of people who die every day in an attempt, really a simple attempt to find a better life. But any future, and we talked about the Global Compact, any future regime must go beyond only a humanitarian approach to also address these root causes of the crisis. Another wall, a smarter border, and criminal sanctions are just an incremental solution to a much, much wider challenge. And I think that disregarding the challenge is not only theoretically wrong, but also politically unwise, given the growing popularity of right-wing movement in the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orgoff, for sharing your thoughts on how migration has been conflated with the global crisis. Next up, we have Mr. Mark Krikorian. Mr. Krikorian is the executive director for the Center for Immigration Studies in Washington, D.C. He frequently testifies before Congress and has published articles in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. A 1984 graduate of the Fletcher School, we would like to invite Mr. Krikorian to share his thoughts with us tonight.
Thank you, Benjamin. As a Fletcher alum, I'm of course delighted to be here. Although after my comments, you may wonder where I went wrong. Last year, then UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said, quote, "Our decisions on immigration policies must always be made by Americans and Americans alone. We will decide how best to control our borders and who will be allowed to enter our country," unquote. Many things can move across borders: goods, capital, ideas, weather, wildlife, but only the movement of people from abroad in large numbers can actually change the constitution, the makeup of the citizenry, potentially even representing an existential threat to nations. Because a nation is not a real estate project after all. It consists entirely of the people in it. This is why national governments will, in the end, maintain authority over who may and may not enter their countries, or reassert that authority in the case of those like EU members, which have surrendered it in part. That was much of the impetus behind Brexit. Those nations that don't maintain or reassert such authority will, by definition, cease to be independent, which is to say sovereign states. Exclusive control over who may enter its territory and join its society is a prerequisite for national self-determination. In other words, not simply state sovereignty, but democracy itself. In a democracy, sovereignty is required for self-government, because if the people, through its constituted processes, whatever they decide, can no longer admit or exclude foreigners based on whatever their conception of their own interests is, then that people no longer governs itself. It is instead a subordinate unit of some larger political entity. To challenge the premise of this session, global migration and national sovereignty aren't necessarily paradoxical. There's a difference, after all, between international cooperation on migration issues, which preserves and is premised on national sovereignty, on the one hand, and supranational migration, management of migration. The latter, despite the protestations to the contrary, including from the foreign minister, is the objective of the two recent UN compacts, the Compact on Migration and the Compact on Refugees. The whole purpose of them is the erosion of national sovereignty over migration, part of the larger post-national, post-sovereignty global governance project. The two UN compacts were obviously intended to lead to supranational regulation of migration, just as the European coal and steel community and the European economic community that followed it were intended to be that. Now, voters were assured that wasn't the case, but in fact, they were always intended to create formal integration and subordination of the formally independent nations to authorities outside. And the global compacts are essentially the first step in the same process with regard to migration. If you want to think of an analogy, it's not a perfect analogy, but there's sort of the European coal and steel community of migration. And this isn't a secret. Professor Jill Goldenzeil has written on the global compacts and said the global compacts represent a new form of international agreement. They are not international law in themselves. However, they are negotiated by states and will be adopted by the General Assembly as something more than a mere declaration. If the global compacts succeed, they will shape state behavior, which will create new norms that will eventually become entrenched in international law. That's the point of these efforts, and that's the reason that the United States withdrew from them. I'm not here speaking on part of the, on behalf of the administration, but that's what happened. That's why the U.S. rejected both compacts, as did Hungary, and why Czechia, Poland, and Israel rejected the migration compact of the two. And then there were many other UN member states that abstained or simply didn't vote for some of them. In other words, they didn't vote to adopt them. But even apart from those two UN compacts, there is already a significant abridgment of democratic control over migration policy in the form of the asylum regime, which was set out in the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees and the 1968 Protocol. Asylum specifically is the issue here. And just to explain in U.S. terminology, asylum and refugees are related, but for purposes of sovereignty, they are very different things. Refugee policy, they're both dealt with under the 1980 Refugee Act, but refugee policy relates to people that we affirmatively bring to the United States. We decide, based on referrals from the UNHCR, nonetheless, we decide to bring people here from abroad as refugees. Asylum is different, and it has very specific relevance to the issue of sovereignty, because asylum, under our law, is claimed by people who are already here, not people we brought here. People who entered the United States lawfully, maybe as tourists or as students, people who enter unlawfully, they sneak into the United States, or people who just walk up to a port of entry and ask for asylum there, and that represents a clear surrender of our control over who may and may not enter the United States. And there are two specific elements, two parts of this that are problematic. The first is the definition of refugee. We can pick and choose whatever refugee we want from abroad to bring here. But with regard to asylum, the definition of refugee is a real problem with regard to sovereignty, because there are 5 grounds. You probably all know this, but I'll go over it anyway. 5 grounds for refugee status: persecution or well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion. Those are all pretty clearly understandable. Or membership in a particular social group. And that last category has become a kind of catch-all for domestic actors, especially, to try to use asylum law to pry open the entry into the United States, essentially to erode the national government's sovereignty over who may come here. Nobody's really clear on what a particular social group meant when it was included in the 1951 convention. They sort of think it counted for kulaks and monarchists who were not involved in politics, but now it's been expanded to people to justify giving asylum to people who fear gang violence, domestic violence, backward cultural practices like female genital mutilation. I talk a lot slower than I thought, so let me hurry up here. The other issue that relates to sovereignty is Article 31 of the Migration Convention, which requires that nations consider illegal immigrants for purposes of asylum. In other words, they don't have to give it to them, but they can't turn someone down simply because they are illegal immigrants. The asylum regime we have now is a post-World War II anachronism. And with the end of the Cold War, from the end of World War II to the end of the Cold War, was a period where the regime that we had set up made sense and was workable. It is an anachronism at this point. And not only was it necessary, in my opinion, for us to vote against the UN compacts, but we are going to get to a point, I think, where the United States is going to pull out of the 1968 protocol itself. We are not parties to the 1951 convention, but the 68 protocol applies those rules to the whole world. And only by pulling out of the 68 protocol can we then change our own law, which will no longer be bound by a treaty commitment, to restore national control over the issue of who comes into the United States, because asylum has long not been a problem in that regard to us, for the United States. But it is becoming an enormous problem. It is the core of the crisis we see on the border. It has nothing to do with fences or any of that stuff. It has to do with asylum law. And until we can reassert national control over asylum law, there will, in fact, be a paradox between migration and national sovereignty. Let me end there.
Thank you, Mr. Krikorian, for your remarks and your perspective on how global compacts can strip nations of their sovereignty. Next up, we have Ms. Laura Rotolo. She is staff counsel and community advocate at the ACLU of Massachusetts, where she focuses on issues relating to immigrants. She joined the ACLU of Massachusetts in 2007, first as a human rights fellow studying immigration detention conditions. A double jumbo, she graduated from Tufts in 1997 and the Fletcher School in 2000. Please welcome back to Tufts, Ms. Laura Rotolo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always so great to be back home at Tufts and the Fletcher School, places that are so dear to my heart, and to talk about an issue that is so dear to my heart, which is migration, what I spend most of my time working on. In 2007, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the law enforcement agency in the United States that deals with deporting people, conducted one of the largest immigration raids in that recent history on the Michael Bianco factory in New Bedford, Massachusetts, arresting over 300 workers, quickly transporting them in chains to a military base that had been rented out for the purpose, and then within 72 hours flying them to remote detention centers in Texas to face deportation. A lawsuit quickly was filed, and stories of mistreatment came up very quickly. At a public event, a few days after the raid, many people stood up and told their story, and one story really stuck out to me. It was a woman who was a worker and had been arrested. She said that she came from the country of Guatemala, but she herself was a native Maya Quiche. And she said that she had come fleeing persecution by a regime that was repressive and had historical roots in support of the United States foreign policy, and that she had come for her own survival, and that she was working at the Michael Bianco factory making parachutes for the US military. And her question was poignant. She said, "My people were on this continent first. We did not create these borders. We're just trying to survive. Who is the US government to tell me that I can't be here?" And that just stood out to me, and it has stuck with me all these years because I really think it highlights the complex history that the United States, like many nations, has with its own sovereignty and with how it keeps people from coming here. And sovereignty is kind of a funny thing. It's almost a legal fiction in a sense. In the United States, you can go back to 1823 to the Supreme Court case of Johnson versus McIntosh. The facts of that case were that there were two grants made over the same parcel of land. It's a property case. The first grant was made by two Native American tribes, and the second grant was made by the United States government. The question was, do Native Americans have the power to give their land, and can an individual receive land from Native Americans? The answer was no. Under something called the Discovery Doctrine, the colonizing power, so the court said, gains title to the land that it discovers, and others' rights are extinguished. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote, "The tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. To govern them as a distinct people was impossible. The law that regulates and ought to regulate the relations between conqueror and the conquered was incapable of application to a people under such circumstances. Discovery gave the exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy either by purchase or conquest." Now, today we see this opinion as deeply flawed, based in Eurocentric racism against Native peoples, but it is still the law, right? It's still the law because to overturn this would mean what? The end of American sovereignty, the end of the nation state of the United States. So why do I talk about this? I talk about this because to me it's so important to remember the history of how the state came to be sovereign, and then to look at the immigration policies that ensued from that. On the one hand, the United States is a country of great generosity. We accept refugees and asylum seekers from all over the world. The waves of immigrants coming in through Ellis Island. And in another sense as well, the United States is able to absorb different cultures. We heard from speaker about national identity. The United States has a very fluid, I think, national identity, to the point where I'll just tell you this one story. I had a friend visiting me from Latin America, and she said that one of the fun things for millennials to do is to watch the Super Bowl, which is like the quintessential American, sports event of the year. And she said, we get together, we watch the Super Bowl, we eat American food. And I said, what kind of food? And she said, like nachos. This idea that, this culture is able to absorb different cultures from different places, especially when it comes to food. So while this country can be incredibly generous, it can also be incredibly cruel in terms of its immigration policies. And we should never forget the racial, religious, and ethnic issues around those immigration policies. So between 1820 and 1860, for example, a big wave of Irish immigrants came, mostly Catholic, of course, leading to the backlash of the, Irish need not apply idea, right? In 1849, part of that backlash included the first anti-immigrant group, something called the Know Nothing Party. In 1882, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, where even though Chinese people were really 0.002% of the population, there was this sense that they were taking over jobs, right? That sounds familiar? They were taking over jobs, and there was a sense that there was going to be less racial purity in the United States, and so the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress. And so part of sovereignty is deciding who's in and who's out. And I want to take us a little bit to the modern day of where we are in this immigration issue. After 9/11, the agency that dealt with immigration issues, Immigration and National Enforcement Service, was changed over to the Department of Homeland Security. So where we had this system of an administrative agency that mostly dealt with visas, asylum, and enforcement as well, we have this one agency dedicated just to immigration enforcement, just to deportation, one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. In the world. It is the second largest law enforcement agency in the US, second only to the FBI. And that means that we have 50,000 people sitting today in jails around the United States waiting to be deported, not because they've committed a crime, but because they are either fighting to stay in the United States or waiting just to be deported. We've seen massive amounts of arrests, of course, and we see what's happening at the border that's leading to children dying in detention, families being separated. So this is the kind of incredible cruelty that I think we also need to be aware of. And of course, this has all led to this crescendo under the Trump administration of openly hostile behaviors against immigrants, starting with the Muslim ban, starting with campaign comments about immigrants, about Mexicans being rapists. And yet, through all of this, people want to come to the United States. People from all over the world come here. It's still a beacon, right? Julio Torres is a comedian who writes for Saturday Night Live, and he's from El Salvador. And he tweeted recently, "Applying for a green card under Trump truly feels like going through a rough patch and then being like, anyway, let's move in together, that'll solve everything." The US is still a place that people still want to come to. I myself came to the United States when I was almost 8 years old from Argentina, and I now have an 8-year-old daughter of my own. And I look at her and I think back to that woman, that Maya Quiche woman from Guatemala, and I think about what it would take me to uproot my daughter, to change everything in her life, to take a dangerous journey, to leave everyone behind and to start anew in a place where I didn't know the culture or the language. And I don't know what that would be, but I know that it would be extreme. And so I want to leave you with a quote from the United Nations, the Center on Migration. They said, "As long as you look on migration as a problem, as something to solve, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to look at it as a human reality that's as old as humankind. And as citizens, we must find a way to just manage it." And so as we consider immigration policy, especially in the United States, where I work, I just want to urge us to both keep in mind our historical context and the humanity and grace this country is really capable of. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rotolo, for providing the human reality through anecdotes as well as some historical context on the paradox. Now, before I open it up to the audience for questions, I would first like to ask the panelists if they have any comments or questions on their other panelists' remarks.
I'd kind of rather have the kids ask, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Okay, our panelists don't have any questions for each other right now, so I'd like to open it up to you guys. Couple rules, just please keep your questions short, hopefully a minute or less. Make sure that they are questions and not comments. We will not allow follow-up questions, just to provide the opportunity to the most people possible to speak. Thank you.
Come on, we have to provoke somebody, jeez. There you go. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Hi, I'm Connor. I am a student at Tufts, and my first question is directed to Dr. Orgad. I was wondering, given the changing population demographics, will we see a shifting identity, or are we going to continue to struggle with the existential crisis that's being seen in a lot of Western states?
Shifting identity in what sense?
Will we see like the current existential crisis amplified as demographics continue to change through 2050, like the graphic that you showed, in your opinion?
You want to collect or?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the identity crisis is one of the, I put it one of the 10, but if I have to rank them, that's one of the most important issues. But in my view, I've written a book on kind of the identity crisis, at least in Europe. That's not necessarily related to the changing demographic of the European societies. One reason for the identity crisis and the changing identity is related to globalization in Europe, to the creation of the European Union, and also to the changing legal order. Multiculturalism, for instance, has been celebrated for decades, differences among people. And perhaps it's not so surprising that after decades of celebrating our differences, all of a sudden it becomes more difficult to find what we have in common. Of course, the changing demographics and migration adds to it, but I think it's not the main problem, or it's not the main reason for that, and in my view it is misused by populist movement against migration.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lu Jianzhang. I'm a Peking University student from Beijing, China. I study international relations and the Japanese language. I have a question directed at Ms. Watalo. Please pardon my English. And then, so I was thinking about one thing, and that is nationalism, whereas Benedict Anderson says about imagined communities. So I thought of an example that might illustrate the concept of nationalism. So if in a random situation, I run around somewhere and say, I have a mysterious connection with 1.4 billion people, most of you probably wouldn't believe me. But then I'd say that I'm Chinese, and another 1.4 billion people is Chinese, and all of a sudden it all makes sense. So I use this example to illustrate just how how nationalism as an ideology, or in some ways as a national myth, has come to shape our world so much that we sometimes are unable to think outside the concepts of these. And my question to you is that, do you think that in order to solve the migration problem, or in some other terms to say, to truly make it a better place for mankind, that the current nation-state system has to undergo some form of dissolution, or at least to go through at least a relatively radical reform? Of course, this seems unrealistic, but then the thing is that the fact that we're talking about immigrants is because we have nation states. If there were no nation states, then there wouldn't be a problem saying you have to migrate to one country or another because countries wouldn't exist. I'm not saying this is realistic, but I'm just curious what you think of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that question. I think that's for all of us, really. I mean, it's already shifting, right? I mean, so we talk about globalization in terms of trade, in terms of goods, in terms of culture, in terms of information. But when it comes to people, it's a little bit different, right? And so I feel like, sorry, I'm just speaking back a lot. Because of,
Closer.
Because of the availability of, especially information traveling so quickly and everyone being so much more connected, we're already seeing a shift. And you're right, that we are talking about immigration because we still deal with this idea of the sovereign and of the nation state. I don't know if we need a radical shift in the way we think about that in order to deal with migration. I think what we need is sensible policies, and I think we could at least start with the existing system. We've had sensible policies in the past, and in the United States, we've had ebbs and flows, ups and downs, different numbers in terms of border crossings, and there's no reason why we can't, we've even been really close to better policies if it weren't for the, Democrat-Republican dynamic in Congress for the past, 8-10 years. I think working within the system to create sensible policies is absolutely doable.
I think the very concept, the sort of John Lennon imagine there's no countries thing, is pernicious. It's not like an ideal that maybe we won't be able to fully achieve. It is fundamentally anti-human. As Aristotle said, people are organized first as families, then as tribes or clans, and then in the polis, in the political community. The nation is our political community, and a nation state, one where most of the people are members of, in some sense, a common group, is the essential prerequisite for self-government. Without it, there can be it's not a guarantee of self-government, it's not a guarantee of democracy, but without it, there cannot be democracy. So, I would only say that this isn't some beautiful ideal that we may only imperfectly achieve. It is actually a pernicious and anti-human concept.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name's Nikki, and I'm a member of this year's EPIIC colloquium. And forgive me, I had to write this down because I want to get it exactly right. My question is for you, Mr. Krikorian. You speak about how asylum claims from victims of domestic abuse and global compacts on migration may be employed to erode American sovereignty. Yet I would ask, are we not eroding our own identity as Americans, a people almost completely descended from immigrants or immigrants ourselves, if we deny individuals who it is within our capability to protect and our obligations to the international community. So my question to you is this. If we can't protect and help others, and we can't cooperate, engage, and debate with the international community, what is the point of sovereignty, of nationhood, and of being an American?
Well, first, of course, obviously we can engage. I mean, I'm for international cooperation between nations. In other words, between sovereign countries that talk to each other and agree on, in the migration sense, on ad hoc bilateral arrangements depending on how conditions change, because there's always going to be changing conditions. But let me address the sort of basic premise that somehow that Americanness means taking in immigration. The fact is we've had different levels of immigration, different kinds of immigration policy throughout our history. We had relatively high, given the size of the population, levels of immigration until the French and Indian War. And then from the French and Indian War until the Irish potato famine in 1848, we had very little immigration. Then from 1848 to 1924, we had about a lifetime's very high levels of immigration from Germany and Ireland, and then later from Italy and Russia and what have you. And then we had about 50 years of very low levels of immigration. American national identity is not based on how many immigrants we take in. Obviously, we're a more recent immigrant society, but every society is an immigrant society. It's just a question of how long ago that happened. So, I mean, our national identity, it's part of our mythos, obviously. Myth in a neutral sense. I don't mean that, in a derogatory way. Clearly, it's part of our national self-conception, but that doesn't dictate any particular immigration policy or any particular government policy at all. Immigration policy is a federal government program. And like the Small Business Administration or farm subsidies or, building an aircraft carrier, it's a federal government program that we, through our democratic processes, can adjust and change. And I think we need to adjust and change this particular policy now.
Thank you.
And if I could add something about asylum, thank you for that question. I think Mr. Krikorian and I disagree on to the impact of asylum laws. The surge that you see right now happening at the border, nothing has changed in asylum laws. Asylum is incredibly difficult to get in the United States. Less than 20% of people who apply are actually granted asylum. Just ask any immigration lawyer and they'll tell you just how difficult it is to prove that you actually are deserving of asylum. And I would submit also that, asylum seekers are among the most vulnerable groups in the world. If they're fleeing persecution and our laws actually apply to them, who are we as a country if we're going to shut that off? If we're going to shut off our wealth and our, luck to be living here in this United States, to close the door behind us on people who are truly, truly needy.
Can I?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to go ahead. And then
Yeah, I also want to kind of disagree with Mark's point. Empirically and normatively. Empirically, I think it would be, and maybe you didn't say it, but it would be naive to assume that without global cooperation, sovereignty and national sovereignty can control the flows of people. You can build wall, they will come from the ocean, from the tunnel, from the air, it's literally impossible to use national sovereignty without global cooperation to control and also to restrict migration. But on normatively, it also shouldn't be like that. Not just because of ethics and human rights, but also because specifically in this country, I know no other countries in the planet whose declaration of independence is based on openness for migration. I mean, one of the reasons, it's mentioned in the declaration, one of the reasons for rebelling King George was that he limited the flaws to the power to admit more migration. So this is not just part of the ethos, that's part of what this country is about.
Let me respond to a couple of things. First of all, the Declaration of Independence thing was about the British monarchy limiting the number of people that were to be brought in order to settle the land. This was, in other words, it wasn't a kind of ideological concept. It was that the British monarchy was attempting to strangle the 13 provinces that joined and declared independence. So this was not an ideological statement. And that part was not an ideological statement. It was one of the sort of specific practical grievances the signers of the Declaration made. Let me, though, respond to sort of both issues on there's nothing we can do about people coming here without multilateral cooperation. The fact is that people come in response to incentives. Nobody wakes up in Kathmandu and says, you know, today I'm moving to Malta. It doesn't work that way. People come in response to incentives and by way of networks that are created through government policy. And this is very true with regard to the flow of ostensible asylum seekers we see on the southern border today. It's true that asylum is difficult to get. Only a small share of people who apply for asylum get it. But getting into the country to apply for asylum is actually very easy, because there's when someone enters the country illegally, they were dropped off by a busload of people. For instance, a smuggler will drop off at the Arizona border. And this isn't a hypothetical, this has happened repeatedly now, because the Mexican highway that connects Baja to the rest of the country is about 20 feet south of the US border there. I've seen it, the trucks driving by. Bus pulls off onto the gravel, whole bunch of people, 100, 200 people get out, and they say, hop over the 3-foot high fence there, which is designed to keep trucks from driving over, but doesn't stop anybody. And as soon as you get in, find a Border Patrol agent, turn yourself in. And if you can't, here's the directions to the Border Patrol office. You can go and knock on the door. And that's happened. You get, at that point, if you say you fear persecution, and they've been coached in order to, with the right terminology, you get what's called a credible fear interview. Basically, it is to make sure that Mickey Mouse isn't talking to you through your dental work. It's that level of, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but almost everybody is approved and gets through that first cut. That is the incentive, not getting asylum at the end of a 2 or 3 year process, because that's irrelevant. The point is to get past the Border Patrol. Half the people on the southern border who now pass that credible fear interview never even go on to apply for asylum. It was a ruse to get past the Border Patrol. And then the vast majority of those who do go through, because if you apply and your case takes more than 6 months, you get a work permit, so there's a reason to do that. Most of them are turned down and then don't go back anyway. So asylum is hard to get. Getting into the country on the pretext of applying for asylum is actually very easy, and that is the incentive that is sucking people in from Central America, and increasingly not just from Central America, but elsewhere. I've met gypsies from Romania who have brought children with them across the border from Canada, specifically in order to in response to this incentive.
Just, I mean, I wouldn't call it easy, right? It's not hopping a 3-foot fence. There, you know, it's a long, treacherous journey. It's a difficult decision even to make. Women are routinely abused and raped on the journey. It's not easy.
And we have given them the incentive to make that trip and take those risks because the payoff is worth it. I sent a crew down to South Texas in 2014 when this broke into the news. And one of them's a Pulitzer Prize-winning former reporter, has lived in Mexico, speaks Spanish like a native. And he was talking to people, and there was some women at the McAllen bus station that the Border Patrol dropped them off at the bus station with a piece of paper, show up in 3 years. And this woman with her friend came, and they had their kids, and she said, well, we were watching CNN back in Guatemala, and they were saying that if you bring a kid with you, they'll just let you in. And then we knew somebody in our town who did that and called us, called back home on the cell phone. And so we figured we'd do it. That's the incentive that we're creating. This is not the weather or the tides that we have no control over. This is created by government policy. It's the same thing in Europe.
I won't belabor this point. I just want to say that I think you're being dismissive of the human cost of what it means to bring a child to the border, and I will stop there.
We agree to disagree.
Josh.
Hello, my name is Josh Clarkson. I'm a sophomore here at Tufts, and my question is for Mr. Krikorian. So substantial research suggests that strengthening legal immigration channels is the way to reduce irregular immigration. As you advocate for the opposite, i.e. limiting legal migration channels, do you fear exacerbating our, quote, national emergency, end quote, to quote our president. Particularly, given that the US unemployment rates are currently at around 4%, why all the worry about legal H-1B visa workers who in 2017 totaled approximately 197,000 new approvals per data from your Center for Immigration Studies, which is approximately 0.0006% of the US population, and these visas can only be extended for a maximum of 6 years. As such, why limit legal immigration?
Okay, well, the basic concept here is that there is some amount of immigration, some number of immigrants who want to come here, and that if we raise the legal caps, then they won't come illegally. In other words, that our caps now are lower than whatever some objective level of immigration is, so that the ones who come in legally do, and then the rest, the difference, come in illegally. And so if we only raise the cap, then there won't be any more illegal immigration. The fact is, there is for all practical purposes, unlimited demand to move to the United States. If we were to double legal immigration from 1 million a year, which is what it is now roughly, to 2 million a year, as the Senate bill from back in 2013 called for, we would just have illegal immigration above that. In other words, there are 4 million people in line who already have petitions submitted for legal immigration. And the only reason it's that low is because of the long waiting periods due to the caps in the various categories. Increase the caps, you're going to have more people actually applying. There is no way to satisfy the demand for legal immigration to such a degree that there won't be any illegal immigration, except to simply eliminate all numerical caps. And that relates to your second part of your question about, with low unemployment, why are we worried about this? I'm not going to go into the H-1B thing. There's no reason not to. It's just that we're limited time here. But the basic concept here is that low unemployment is precisely the time when you don't want to increase immigration, because what it's doing, and we're seeing this already even with the high level of immigration we have now, business is forced to engage workers it would not otherwise be interested in hiring. When employers have not yet succeeded in, through their lobbyists, finagling in some deal to increase immigration even more, what are they doing? They're saying, oh, geez, okay, well, we'll have to see if we can hire some ex-cons, or recovering addicts, or the disabled, or teenagers with no work experience, or single moms who have to negotiate a flexible work schedule. Those people are people that employers would rather not have to deal with. So what a tight labor market does, which we can preserve through lower immigration, is empower the person looking for a job instead of empowering the employer who has the jobs to give out. In other words, I want employers to hustle for workers, not workers to have to hustle for jobs.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Luca. I'm from University of São Paulo in Brazil, and I have a question for Ms. Rotolo. So there are some authors that consider that that sovereignty is dead nowadays because of these paradox and being incapable of dealing with these nowadays issues that demands a lot of cooperation. Some others try to save the concept, just limiting it. So the states still have the power of the sovereignty, but is limited, so they can use it to justify not giving basic human rights. But considering the migration issue, it generates another problem, because there's a lot of countries that still do not consider migration as a basic human right. So how can we pass through this paradox with sovereignty if we still have this other problem as migration not being considered a human right worldwide? Thank you.
Right. I think that's a really important context and a really important lens to look at this issue through. One of the first things I did when I came to work at the American Civil Liberties Union was to talk to people who were incarcerated facing deportation. And in Massachusetts, we have the sort of, I would say, privilege of really having immigrants from all over the world. It's one of the states with the most diverse immigrant populations. But the thing that I would hear over and over and over again from Africans, Asians, Latin Americans was the idea of their human rights. And you know, in the United States, the human rights model is not as strong as it is in other countries. The example, you know, if you talk to just, you know, Americans on the street, they may not really understand what human rights are. And so I think anytime we are able to bring that model into United States politics, it's really helpful. The idea that, you know, migration is a human right, that our, you know, bodily integrity is a human right, that, you know, self-determination, that all these things are actually considered rights in the rest of the world. And that has been a challenge for me, working in a very American organization, and coming from abroad and having studied human rights actually here at Fletcher, to use the human rights model more in the United States with United States policymakers, because it can be very powerful, and it has been used by advocates on the ground to say, look, it's not just about you know, sovereignty and borders, it's also about rights as human beings.
Can I jump in for a second?
Okay.
So migration is a human right. So as a matter of a legal order, there is no human right for migration. It's not just some countries, period. There is no human right for migration, and there is no human right for citizenship as well. But I'm just wondering, what do you mean by a human right for migration? What's the meaning of this human right can be? And whether you think, if there is a human right for migration or citizenship or both, whether it will make human rights situation, conditions in the world better or worse? Just a rhetoric question, you don't have to answer.
Well, I mean, you weren't waiting for an answer. You know.
No, of course not.
I mean, what the only comment I'd say is that you have a natural right to leave your country. You do not have a natural right to go into somebody else's country.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marianne from the University of Ottawa, and I have a question for Mr. Krikorian. I wanted to ask, so over the course of the symposium, we've had a lot of discussions about misinformation in the context of discussing migration issues, and I was wondering whether, or what your feelings are on whether it is dangerous to discuss the intentions of why individuals or groups such as the Gypsy or individuals from the South come to the United States in such mass kind of generalizations, such as they want to come for free work, or because our asylum laws are so lax, and on the basis of anecdotal evidence of one reporter going south. Do you not feel that perhaps that is a bit dangerous to make such mass generalizations without recourse to specific facts to support that?
We need to understand what's motivating people in order to determine whether our policies need to change. And, you know, there is, in fact, data on why people are leaving. The Guatemalan government did a survey not that long ago on why people were leaving Guatemala. 91% of them said they did so for economic reasons. Only a handful of them mentioned violence or gang violence or anything. This is a narrative that has been developed in this country. It is not the fact. Now, some people are leaving because of violence, and clearly the disorder in some of these countries is one of the things that drives people, but the narrative of those who oppose border enforcement is that these people are refugees and, you know, basically hashtag believe all refugees. And that's not the way, that's not only does the data show that's not true, but the individual examples that are not just ours, but, you know, the New York Times has spoken to individual migrants, all kinds of people have, and, you know, they're saying the same thing. We heard that if I brought my kid with them, they'd let me in. I'm here because it's poor and I couldn't make ends meet back in Honduras, and so that's what I'm coming for. You know, I mean, it's just true.
But I guess as an audience, I would say it would be helpful to be presented with those facts.
I mean, that may be true for some people. I think generalizing is what we're talking about, right? Number one, economic, devastation is not just not making ends meet, right? There are people who can't make ends meet, can't survive, can't literally survive because of their situation. And then if you look at, Honduras and El Salvador, like those are places where people are fleeing devastating gang violence and a murder rate that is really devastating communities. So I think there is a narrative you could talk about in terms of economic migrants. It doesn't mean people are just coming so they can earn a little bit more, right? It's because people have made that decision to leave their homes because really there is nothing for them. And if you want to talk to a Venezuelan right now, that's one example.
Okay, I'm Çağlar Özden. I'm a participant, and I noticed the students are asking very innocent questions, nothing provocative, so I think I'll change the mood. I don't know if their grades depend on the kind of nice questions they ask. First of all, to Mark Krikorian, I've obviously read your writings. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the things you say, but I at least find your arguments internally consistent, so that's great. But to Dr. Orgad, your arguments, I found, how to put it politely, maybe not so politely. Some of them are incorrect, and some of them are misleading. Everybody attributes to Mark Twain lies, damn lies, and then statistics. Actually, it goes back to Disraeli. So some of the numbers you presented are quite misleading, and let me give you a couple examples. For example, you put the numbers from 1960 to today. 1960 is 15 years after the Second World War. Europe is completely devastated, right? Who would want to go there? Plus you have the Russians and Soviet Union, the Cold War, the nuclear weapons. So that's why it's an artificially low number. And as Mark said, 1924, the next 60 years, the US really did not have an active migration policy, so it was artificially low. So when you start the numbers at 1960, right, and when you look at today, of course it's going to be high. Now, what we call in economics, there's this issue of reverse causality. I'm going to take more than 1 minute if you indulge me. The issue of reverse causality. The reason why migration is high today because it was very low at that day, right? Because there was an endogenous policy response both in Europe and in the US, and we changed the numbers. So, I mean, not only in 1960 the numbers were so low, the Germans were begging the Turks to come, paying them to come, and not just was the Turks, it was they were paying the Yugoslavs and the Portuguese, so on and so forth. So that's one example. Second thing that really struck me, you said national identity was a set issue until the migrants came. Now, I've been in the US for 30 years. I'm relatively interested in American history. These guys have been debating the national identity for the last 300 years, right? And it's not a settled issue. You look at the writings of Jefferson or the Federalist Papers and everything there, the issue of what is to be an American is there. And think of it, forget about the US, go to France, read the annual reports of Académie Française, right? How they try to eliminate all these regional languages to create the French identity. Or yet, ask a Catalan or a Scot what they think about national identity, right? These are fluid concepts that change, or an Indian. What does it mean to be an Indian, right? I mean, every country in the world, every person, every child, I have 3 kids, they're struggling with their identity. Forget the national identity, right? It's a fluid concept, so it is going to change over and over. Third example, you said there is ample empirical evidence the second and the third generations become more radical, more anti-liberal, anti-this, or than their parents. I am yet to see convincing evidence of that. I would love it if you gave me convincing evidence, because for every evidence you give, I can cite 2 or 3 papers which show the opposite. Now, one last thing. I'm sorry I'm taking so much time.
Yes, so long as there's a question at the end.
No, the question is how is he
already,
how is he going to answer these things, because I find it dangerous. You put these graphs and the number of the people and the shares percentages, and it kept on coming to the Muslims. Right? Oh, the Muslims are going to be 20%. Muslims are going to be 30%, this and that. What worries me, so as a side project, I have been going through the media, the newspapers. At the time, there was only newspapers of the US, exactly 100 years ago. As Mark said, he put 1924, I would put it at 1918, when the borders of the United States closed. And if you look at some of the researchers, but most of the journalists, oh, how many Catholics do we have? Oh, how many Jews we have? Oh, forget about the Orthodox, right? They're going to open the doors, they're going to overrun this country. What happened? My best friend from college, his family is from Prague. They couldn't come to the US. 90% were killed. They were Jewish. Right? This is what happened. So this identity, this approach of labeling people that way, they're going to overcome, they're going to this and that. I mean, you're saying, look, these are the numbers. Oh, it's not a big deal, but wink, wink. These are the seeds of what is yet to come. I find that really dangerous. There are whatever, depending on how you count the numbers, how many billion Muslims there are, but how many billion Christians there are. As the minister said, and somebody else said before that, maybe Mark said, everybody's migration experience is unique. Everybody's individuality is unique. But putting labels that way and putting people into boxes and creating, look how fast they're growing. Oh, the Africans are going to be 50% of the world population. Can you believe that? Well, nobody's telling the white Americans in this room not to have children. The reason the whites had whatever 25% of the population 100 years ago is because they completed their economic transformation and public health and sanitation before everybody else did. Right? So I find it really dangerous to put labels and putting those trends and saying it's not a big deal, but just to let you know. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One of the differences between Israeli identity and American identity is that Israeli identity is we ask the question the way you ask them, so I kind of like it. We are less polite than the average Americans. But you ask 4 questions. I don't know if I can address them all, but I'll try to address the easiest one. Data on the UN, why the 60s? There is only one reason for that. That's the UN statistics, and the UN started to collect statistics from the 1960s. Nothing to do with like there were statistics from the 40s, and I chose to put it from the 60s. The UN statistics, if you were to go to the Demographic Population Department, started to collect in the 60s, and to today, those are the data. This is what we have. Maybe if we have data from the 40s or from the 50s, the graph will be different. We don't know, but I can tell you that if you take a look at the 70s and the 80s, you see still the trend of growing percentage of migration. This is almost undisputable that migration is growing worldwide, especially to Western societies. It is almost undisputable among demographics, whether you are more liberal or less liberal, that immigration will continue to grow. So the UN statistic is just the way it is on the UN database. Second, so I mentioned that in some cases, specifically in Europe, the second generation is more hostile compared to the first, and the third is even more hostile compared to the second. I can give you many examples. I have written a book on not specifically on that, but one chapter addressed with all the examples. The Pakistanis in the UK. This is a case in which the third generation Pakistani in the UK, when you ask hostility to liberal values, hostility to British values, hostility to European values, and justifications of violence in resolving political conflict, in all of those 4, you find the third generation Pakistani in the UK justify more violence and hostile more to UK values, European values, and liberal values compared to the second generation, compared to the first generation. There is not one study on that. There are quite many on that. It doesn't mean that those are all the cases, but indeed we have some cases like that. Look, I have written an article called Illiberal Liberalism. I think many of the things that are going now on in Europe are illiberal, and I think I made very clear that I see this as moral panic, and I even call this demographobia. So I'm completely with you. There is no dispute or no debate between us. But maybe we do have a debate that I think ignoring this data is also not politically wise, because those data are the motivations beyond some of the most right-wing populist movement in Europe. And my view is that we have to see the data, and we have to see what we are going to do with them and how to address them. And this is, as I said at the end of my thing, it's not just theoretically right, but also politically wise to see the data and to understand them. And last point about identity, look, this is the most tricky one, right? So what is national identity? I'm completely with you. And I think that it's almost impossible to define national identity, and you're right that in these countries there is a debate on the essence of Americanism for more than 200 years. However, my point was about Europe, and what you see in Europe is actually fascinating. In the last decade, and you see it because of migrations, European societies which have never had, at least since World War II, a need to define their identity, all of a sudden started to have committees to investigate what is their national identity. And the reason for that is mainly migration, because the migrants, if you want, the other motivate or push us to define ourselves. In Britain, there was a government committee to define Britishness, and the British government, after 2 years of investigation, published a Britishness pie. This is our identity. In France, in 2009, this was before the election. Back then, President Sarkozy, he made a different thing. He said, unlike the British, the French are not going to establish a committee to investigate Frenchness because it's un-French to have a committee. But he did like a reality TV show. He posed to the French public, the French population, a question, quote, for you, what does it mean to be French? And then the government collected 3 months, thousands, by the way, of responses from the public, and the government just published the report, said this is not what the French government thinks is Frenchness, but what the French population just defined Frenchness. You have such debates in not all European societies, but in 14 European societies that I can refer you to. And in all of them, one after one, the main trigger is migration. And I think it's just natural. It doesn't mean that, again, it's bad or good. It's just, it's there. You can have a follow-up if you want.
Yeah, we're gonna continue on just in the interest of giving the most people the time or the chance to speak. So thank you.
Thank you. My name's Scott. I'm a second year at the Fletcher School, and my question is for Mr. Krikorian. There was something I was a little confused about with your presentation that I'm hoping you can help clarify. You seemed very concerned about issues of sovereignty, of American sovereignty, and of American self-governance being threatened by immigration. In 2010, just after the earthquake killed 160,000 people in Haiti, you wrote an article where you said that perhaps Haiti's problems were that it wasn't colonized long enough, and you advocated for it becoming a UN trust territory. And in that article, you failed to discuss the independence debt, which was a tool the French used to impoverish Haiti for a century and a half, but maybe you just forgot. But in that article on Haiti, you had no qualms about, you expressed no reservations about colonizing them. You had no qualms about their sovereignty. There were no questions around their right to self-governance or to self-determination. So my question is, does your definition of sovereignty only apply to white people?
No, it doesn't. I'm glad you asked the question. You didn't read the whole tweet, the whole blog post and the one that followed it. My point, to the extent this is relevant, first let me say that migration doesn't threaten sovereignty. It's, in other words, self-government is not threatened by immigration. Self-government is threatened by global governance over migration policy, as it would be over any other kind of policy. You brought up the Haiti thing, I'll mention it. My point on Haiti, and there's really no disputing this, is that it's a cruel irony of history that the Haitians won independence too soon, that they have every right to rise up against your master, but they rose up about a generation before France ended slavery anyway in this whole empire. And had they lost, they would have ended up, frankly, in a much better situation, like, for instance, Guadeloupe and Martinique, which were sugar colonies run by slaves, owned by France, that never won their independence, and now have, enjoy subsidies from the metropole, just like Barbados, an English sugar colony run by slaves, which didn't win its independence. That was the whole point to the Haiti thing, that it's a cruel irony of history that people who succeeded in grasping, in fighting and winning their independence from France probably would have been better off had they lost. And in the long run, it seems, I don't really see any argument against that. There's nothing to do with migration, honestly, but you brought it up, so I'm happy to straighten the...
You didn't really answer my question on sovereignty, but but in a sense,
Sure,
you
everybody,
did quite
every country
clearly.
has, every people has a sovereign right to determine what happens in its own territory. Absolutely, of course.
Hello, my name is Aris Bilinis. I am a PhD student from Padion University of Athens. So I would like to ask, my question is for any of you. So in my country, over the last years, we have attested a very large number from people of Middle East who have fled Middle East to come to Greece and generally in Europe. And some of them, or most of them, have even gone through 5 or 6 countries until they reach Greece and Europe. But, of course, if we have a look at history, we'll find that destabilization in the Middle East is, of course, nothing new. If we trace back to the 80s, for example, we had the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, we had the war between Iraq and Iran, the civil war in Lebanon, all of which created a huge number of deaths and devastation. But at the time, the number of those who came to Europe was almost zero compared to what is happening now. So I would like to ask, what and how does the concept and the practice of national sovereignty changes through the time? Since I guess if we check at the dictionary, the meaning we'll find will be the same now or 30 years before. Thank you.
And I feel like your presentation is very on point. But I just want to say, so you're sort of taught in, International Relations 101, the concept of sovereignty is about control over a physical territory or borders. And as you said, that definition may not have changed. But the idea that letting more or fewer immigrants in is an attack on sovereignty, I think you can challenge throughout history, right? In the United States alone, if you look at, the period of Ellis Island, where we didn't have caps on visas, where we had essentially almost open door policy, nobody would argue that the United States was not sovereign, right? And that the idea of lifting a cap here or changing numbers there is going to challenge the very nature of this sovereign state when, we still have the military that can, protect the borders or enforce border law. I just don't think that's a reasonable argument.
I mean, my sense was, if I understood your question correctly, is Russians invaded Afghanistan, millions of people left, but they all went to Iran and Pakistan next door. You didn't have a big flow into Europe. And what's different now, I think, is what you're saying. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'd say 2 things changed. One is the cheapness and effectiveness of communications and transportation simply makes it easier to know what's going on elsewhere and to get there. And the other thing is Europe's incentives. I mean, the million people who flowed into Europe pretending to be Syrians in 2015 was the result of Angela Merkel's policy that, she would not enforce the requirement that you had to apply for asylum in the first country you got to. So everybody said they didn't want asylum in Greece. They didn't want to stay in Greece. They wanted to go to Germany. And once the German government said they could come to Germany, they did.
Zach?
Hi, my name is Zach Goldberg. I'm a sophomore here at Tufts, and I'm a member of the EPIIC class. Thank you all for giving us your time tonight, but my question is directed specifically to Mr. Krikorian. When you spoke about how the reason why the U.S. decided not to sign the Global Compact on Migration was because it posed a threat to national sovereignty. And you also believe that that is why the U.S. will be pulling out of the 1967 protocol. So my question is then, do other UN documents that are also non-legally binding, such as, say, even the Declaration of Human Rights, also pose a threat to national U.S. sovereignty, and will we also be pulling out of those?
Well, I mean, I have no idea if we're pulling out of the convention and the protocol or not. I'm just saying that I think it's required that we do so. I don't know. Give me a whole list and I'll think about it and go through it. I don't have a list at hand of agreements that we should be pulling out of, but, generally speaking, yeah, I'm not averse to that, but I don't have like I said, I don't have a list that I think we should be pulling out of. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good example, though, because these kind of agreements are honored only by countries that already honor human rights and blithely ignored without consequences by those that don't. I mean, you know, who are the signatories to the, you know, go through the list of signatories to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, I don't have it in front of me, but I guarantee you a whole heck of a lot of them couldn't give a rat's patootie about what that thing says, and it has no consequence for them for ignoring it. So, in other words, this is another one of these examples where, you know, it's sort of analogous to what's called anarcho-tyranny in domestic societies, where people who are going to obey the laws anyway the rules are held against them. But for people who couldn't care less about following the rules, they're able to ignore them without consequence.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us tonight. My name is Madison. I'm a sophomore here at Tufts, also part of the EPIIC class. So my question is directed at Dr. Orgad and Ms. Rotolo. So we've heard from Mr. Krikorian quite a bit about his definition of sovereignty, which he said, I believe, twice encompassed the idea that control over who enters is, by definition, sovereignty and also central to democracy. So I'm just curious, if possible, if we could hear a similarly concise definition of sovereignty in terms of migration from you two, so we can hear where you're coming from directly.
Oh gosh, I mean, that's such a complicated question, and it's kind of, you know, what I was talking about in terms of the history of what it means to be a sovereign state and where the United States especially derives that sovereignty from, and how complicated and difficult that history is. I mean, if we really want to look back into the United States as a colonist, as other places as well that derive their sovereignty from colonialism. To me, I mean, I understand the sort of philosophical question, and I think it's a very interesting one. But in my day-to-day work, it's really about how do we deal with the system we have now, right? So, like, assuming the United States is a sovereign country, you know, how do we deal with what's going on now? How do we deal with the people who are trying to come who can't? How do we deal with the, you know, subclass of people who cannot assert their rights because they don't have legal status in the United States? So, you know, in my world, what happened in Boston the other day is one that's on the top of my mind. For example, there was this worker in Boston who had a workers' compensation issue, got hurt on the job. He was undocumented. He filed a complaint, as is his right to do under federal law and state law. And the government retaliated against him and put him into deportation proceedings, right? So that happens because he is, you know, a second-class person in the United States because he doesn't have status. So whether that's, you know, that comes back to sovereignty, whether it comes back to border policy, asylum policy, immigration policy, to me, the real-world consequences are how do we deal with people who want to be here and need to be here but can't do so legally.
I think the definition of sovereignty is radically transformed in every day that we see it. Not necessarily because of migration, but as long as I'm not sure that I agree to the definition that sovereignty is the ability to control, but as long as we take this definition as the starting point, you don't have full sovereignty, and no country has full sovereignty in the field of migration. First of all, you have laws, international law, in Europe also European law, and the international law is also obligatory, customary international law, for instance, in the case of the United States. So for instance, racial discrimination would be unlawful under international law, treaty law and customary international law. So law, for instance, is one example for the limitation of sovereignty. But I think the main limitations of sovereignty are not legal rules. You have global economy, you have globalization, you have technology. You have lots of limits to sovereignty. And to see sovereignty today the way we saw it 40 years ago, and to be naive enough to assume that we can do the same things factually but also legally and morally is completely unfeasible.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brugank and I'm a second-year student at Tufts, and I had a question for Mr. Krikorian. So please correct me if I interpreted you wrong, but so the principle that seems to underlie your argument seems to be the concept of sovereignty, in that every country, every state should have a right to determine its own migration policy regardless of what that policy is. So you
earlier quoted, I believe you quoted Aristotle when you, on the units of associations, the first being the family, and then the tribe, and then the polity. And the polity in this case would be the state. But the state is a very particular type of polity with specific characteristics, and I would go on to call it a manufactured polity. But surely you would agree that the most basic fundamental unit here would be the person. So my question to you is, why should we prioritize state security over human security? Why should there not be a common understanding or a common agreement of how to promote human security that transcends manufactured borders?
I mean, all human societies other than the biological family are manufactured in some sense. But the fact is that the nation state is the largest collection of people that can have a common sort of moral order that they subject themselves to. And what you're suggesting is that that there's an, I mean, to put it in the migration context, that there's an individual right to mobility that states should not be able to interfere with. And that really, when you get right down to it, is the core of the immigration debate. Do self-governing peoples, through their constitutional processes, have the right to decide who comes in and who doesn't? And my answer is yes, they do. That's the whole, I mean, if they don't, they're not self-governing. And I mean, the whole point of a state is that it is a collection of people who, or a liberal democratic state is a collection of people who who make rules for themselves, who govern themselves. And to assert an individual right to move into someone else's country is to say that self-government does not exist. It negates self-government. And I reject that. I mean, that's a values question. It's not something you can show or determine with statistics. Its question is which do you prefer? Which do you think is right? And, it's pretty, you know what I think.
Could I quickly rephrase my question?
Sure.
So if you were to define human security as freedom from the fear of violence and persecution, do states, as you call it, some sort of a moral polity, do not have a responsibility to accommodate these people? And
no.
No. Okay.
Can I think at the core of, yeah, please.
No, go ahead.
At the core of the issue is the conflict or the tension between individual self-determination and collective self-determination. And both are recognized human rights. Now, individual self-determination doesn't mean that you can, by defining where do you want to live, you can go everywhere in the planet. You know, it's like the right to family life. You have a right to marry, but you have to find someone who is willing to marry you, right? And collective self-determination also includes, and this is a right, this is not just a collective right or group right, this is a human right. It's actually the first human right in the two treaties from the 66, also for cultural self-determination. And there are no easy solutions, but I can tell you, this is the point that I wanted to tell you, that when I was a student, this was the 90s, and this was the end of it, the period of the end of history, and open borders and globalization, and we all thought, and we were also taught like that at the university, that the world is going to be one global planet shared by the earth belongs to everyone, etc. Whatever our moral perception on that, there is a reality outside. And what we see in the last 3 to 5 years, that reality is incompatible with some of our moral and ethical ideals. And the question, which is really at the core of migration, is how to reconcile between our ethical standards, what we believe that the world should be, with the political reality outside there. And in the political reality outside, you see that people are increasingly searching more and more collectives which give them identity and sense of belonging and kind of a feeling of the community. And how to reconcile between that, certainly we don't have answers here, but that's really the core of the issue on the immigration and sovereignty paradox.
And I just wanted to add, a little bit more about the concept of of non-refoulement, right? That this is a universally, I would say almost universally understood and accepted concept that we should not return people to a place where they will face danger, right? And even, in the United States, we're signatories to the Convention Against Torture, and so at the very least, there is that threshold level that I think we can start from there. That we do have an obligation under our international agreements and even our own United States law not to return people to a place where they will be tortured or killed. And I think that is a base level where we really need to stand from there and up. And I don't see that, giving room for those people to come here, how does that hurt U.S. sovereignty or U.S. democracy? I don't think it does. I think, in fact, it makes it stronger.
Thank you. And before Josh speaks, I'd just like to say that these will be the last 3 questions of the night so that we end on time. Thank you.
Okay, so once again, this is directed to Mr. Krikorian. So I respectfully disagree with, a number of your arguments regarding migration, but I disrespectfully and vehemently disagree to, step up the provocativeness of my question. I disrespectfully disagree with your statements regarding Haiti. And so I'm going to come back to those points. So Haiti. So you suggested that Haiti would have been better off following the arc of Martinique or Guadeloupe. Both of these islands remain départements d'outre-mer of France. The heads of state of Martinique and Guadeloupe have included Napoleon III, Charles de Gaulle, and Emmanuel Macron today.
Sure.
Last time I checked, the heads of state of France have been white. The majority of Martinique and Guadeloupe have been not white. Today, about 1% to 2% of these countries' populations are, descendants of whatever white Europeans once, consolidated colonial power. And this Béki class, as they're referred to, they consolidate over 90% of the wealth in these nations. They have immense social, economic, and political power. They dominate these islands, and the majority cannot have their voice heard. These islands are not sovereign. So you have suggested that Haiti would be better off being a non-sovereign state, and I simply find that appalling.
Yeah.
And I would like to hear your response.
No. I mean, nobody in Guadeloupe and Martinique don't want independence. That's the whole thing.
How do you know that?
Mayotte is another one of the overseas departments of France. They have no interest in independence.
I'm not talking about Mayotte,
British
sir.
Honduras did not want independence until the British guaranteed to lay a military facility there to prevent Mexico and Guatemala from eating it up. At the very tail end of colonialism, the colonies themselves have such a good deal, completely reversed from the past.
Are you suggesting that colonialism was good?
It was a fact. I don't know if it was good or bad. No, probably not. But it wasn't good for the colonists, really, or the colonizers, or the colonized.
So
but
is neocolonialism good
Look,
today?
Are Guadeloupe and Martinique better off than Haiti? Yes or no? Are they?
In what sense?
In any sense. You name it. In any sense. Are they economically better off? Do
They're
people
economically
thrive
better off, but not free.
They're not. And if they wanted independence, they would get it. They don't want it because it wouldn't pay. It wouldn't be worth it. You would lose the enormous. It's very similar in the sense to Puerto Rico. I'm actually a Puerto Rican sovereigntist. I want Puerto Ricans to have their own country. Puerto Ricans don't want it in the same way that the people in Guadeloupe and Martinique don't want it, because it's such a good deal now. But that's not even the point to Haiti. The point is, are those places that are identical to Haiti better off for not having succeeded in getting their independence? Yes or no? The answer is not debatable.
Okay. I find that dissatisfactory.
And I find it very problematic that you're speaking on behalf of Puerto Ricans, Haitians.
Well, Puerto Ricans have voted over and over and over again not to be independent.
I know many
want
Puerto
them to be
Ricans who would
independent.
like to be independent. I know many of them. And I think I'm not going to speak about Haiti. It's not an area that I'm an expert, so I know I'm way out of my depth, and I would suggest that you two are.
But he has a point, was saying that maybe they are better off, but they are not free.
Yeah,
That's also a
that's
point.
okay. It's fine. I mean, I don't. But yeah.
Izzy?
Hi, my name's Izzy. I'm a sophomore student at Tufts. I'd like to direct this at Mr. Krikorian as well, though I appreciate the input from the other panelists. I'm trying to understand how you would ideally conceive the role of the UN in the asylum and refugee process Because earlier you stated that one of the problematic parts of the asylum process was that asylum seekers arrive directly to the U.S., while people applying for refugee status are processed through agencies such as UNHCR. So while as I understood it, there is this need for agencies such as UNHCR to process refugees because the U.S. does not want them processed on our land. But meanwhile, you also expressed a distaste for the UN Global Compact on Migration, for these kind of standardized overview goals for the well-being of migrants. Also, the UN Global Compact also addresses the UN Global Compact is also addressing the root causes of migration and also seeks to decrease the reasons why people need to migrate. So how do you reconcile these views, this need for agencies such as UNHCR, and placing trust in UNHCR? Wouldn't that inherently suggest a certain global trust in UNHCR's understanding of refugee status?
Oh, I actually don't have a lot of trust in the UNHCR, and I don't think that our refugee policy mandates having the UNHCR. I mean, right now, UNHCR picks virtually all of the refugees that we resettle. I think that's actually terrible. I have no interest in contracting that out to the UNHCR. I mean, the premise of your question, that I challenge the premise of your question. We do not, I don't think the UNHCR should have the role that it does in U.S. refugee resettlement.
From my understanding of UNHCR, the process that refugees who are resettled go through is incredibly stringent. All family members go through extensive background checks and extended family members. So what part of that process do you particularly take issue with and not trust?
Well, it's not, there's two things. One is not trust, one is disagree with. Even if all of it were trustworthy, and a lot of the UNHCR decisions on who gets resettled is actually done by locally employed people, and so there have been actual instances of corruption, people paying to be on the list for submission, et cetera. But assuming none of that happened, my issue is not that I don't trust the UNHCR, it's the criteria we use for who's selected for resettlement. Resettlement should be reserved only for the most desperate people who don't have anywhere to go and never will have anywhere to go. And the vast majority of people that the UNHCR refers for resettlement do not fit those criteria, even under the UNHCR's own telling. UNHCR classifies all the people that it recommends, submissions they're called, for resettlement to third countries. They classify them as normal, in other words, sort of routine cases, urgent cases, and emergency cases. The vast majority are routine cases. Emergency and urgent last year made up 17%. The previous year, they only made up like 6% of the people they referred. So it's the criteria itself that we use for whom we pick to resettle. Because, and I'll say another provocative thing, in case you guys haven't been provoked enough, large-scale refugee resettlement is immoral. It is morally wrong. It costs 12 times as much. We actually spent 6 months figuring out the cost. The 5-year cost of resettling a refugee from the Middle East to the United States is 12 times greater than what the UNHCR calculates it takes to take care of somebody in the countries where they've taken their initial refuge. It's obviously better to come here, but what we are doing is picking one person out to resettle instead of using those same resources to help 12 people back in, say, Turkey, where there's a lot of Syrians. The analogy here is we're giving caviar to one person instead of rice and beans to 12 people. It is purely a selfish matter to resettle refugees on a large scale. We do it to make ourselves feel better, rather than using those resources to help a dramatically larger number of people back where they've taken their initial refuge. So my issue is not the UNHCR is untrustworthy, although it often may be. It's that we are simply using, and they are using, I would submit, the wrong criteria to decide who should be resettled in a third country.
Mark, would you support global quotas on refugees?
No.
No?
Absolutely not.
So any other global responsibility sharing, or it's just a matter of sovereignty, period?
Yeah. I mean, maybe if you come up with an example I could think of, maybe, but no, I can't think of any.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chloe from France. I thank you for your remark. I think the delegation appreciated it. So, Mr. Krikorian, you made it clear that you think that immigration is a threat to state sovereignty. But I live in a country that went through 3 waves of immigration. The US is a country of immigration. And so in our countries, minorities and different communities are a part of our history. I go to school with people from different horizons, and especially North African communities in France are very important in our everyday lives. They're a part of our politics because they're a part of France. And it seems that when you say that immigration poses a threat towards sovereignty, you're forgetting about the people, and which is quite funny when we're in the US or when we're talking about France, 2 countries eagerly promoting democracy everywhere. Do you think it's worth it to have a strong sovereign state with closed borders, but with divides within these countries? Because, when we put the question of restrictive immigration policies, when we think about closing borders, then controversies arise in our countries, and then we have debates in France, we have Islamophobia, and then we can see fractures. So is it worth it to be that strong, but all of us divided?
Well, the question is, I would flip the question around. Is it really worth pursuing the policies that we've been pursuing now, which are leading to political tumult and convulsions in the countries where a large section of the populace is basically rejecting the elite consensus that led to the immigration policies? That's what Trump is about. That's what Brexit's about. That's what the FN, or whatever it's called now in France, and all the various versions, iterations of that everywhere. I mean, this is a contentious issue. You can't say, well, let's not crack down on it because cracking down would create political dissension, when in fact not cracking down is also creating political dissension. I'm not sure that this is an issue that you can avoid political controversy and political divides about.
I just wanted to say that debates like this, they just bring fractures in our society, and I think it's really sad, and I think it's not really productive, and yeah.
Yeah, and one point I'd make about this fractures of society, part of the point of reducing immigration, this is a policy matter apart from the sovereignty issue, but sort of within our policy making, part of the point of reducing immigration is actually to allow those fractures to heal or to meld together. Why, people say, there are restrictionists who say, 1965 America was mostly white, and then we messed it up by changing immigration policy. Well, that takes a snapshot of America after 40 years of very low immigration, which allowed the fractures and fissures which were created by the earlier immigration waves to be reduced, and we were knit together as a people more by other things too, the experience of the World War II, et cetera. But the reduction in immigration permitted the, if you will, the digestion of the earlier immigration waves, such that now people say, well, most Americans are white. Really? That's true, I guess, in some sense, but I'm Armenian. I have relatives who own houses that have restrictive covenants on the deeds, which are no longer valid now, but that say Armenians can't own this house. The fact that I'm an Anglo in California is a testament to reductions in immigration that permitted the process of assimilation and amalgamation of earlier waves to take place. And that's sort of relevant to the intensity point from before. In other words, that part of the reason you want less intense, which is to say lower levels, in my opinion, of immigration spread out, is to more effectively allow those people and the people who are already here to come to an accommodation and develop a common sense of belonging. You can't do that with ongoing very high levels of immigration. It doesn't work.
I would have yet to see a study that says that the more homogenous a group of people is the more accepting and open and liberal and least racist they are. I think that's obviously quite the opposite. And the idea that we're going to shut our borders so that we can all learn to get along has been proven time and time again to be untrue, right? Because of, in the United States, these waves of people that have been excluded, from the Chinese to the, Irish to the modern day Latin Americans who are so vilified. I think the idea that we're all going to grow more accustomed to diversity by shutting our borders doesn't pass the laugh test.
Maybe a last point. I think, at the two extreme, you have those restrictionists that say, okay, we close the borders, period. That's national sovereignty. We can accept none if we want. On the other side...
Which isn't my position.
Yeah, no, I didn't say that. Of course, it's not your position. I didn't say that. I just said the other two extreme. On the other extreme, you have those who said open borders, period. The planet belongs to everyone. We have to have open borders and to have mix and match as much as we want. I think most people, including, I believe, these three panelists, including me, would agree that the middle way is that there is a number in which it becomes too much, too fast to accommodate. And the numbers or the cap is disputed. There is no kind of a magic solution to say, okay, 5 million is too much, 10 million is too much. I gave a few months ago in Denmark, I gave them the example, it's a small country, Denmark. What happened, what would be the people there were for open borders within Europe? And I said, what if now 10 million Germans wants to move to Denmark? Hypothetical scenario. You can't blame them for most of the things that you blame the migrants. So obviously there is no national security risk. They would be hard workers, not the Germans they will not create unemployment. They are liberal. You go, all the list, everything is okay. They will presumably learn the Danish language in the second generation or at least the third generation. So what's the ground to exclude them? And you can say that you can do the same hypothetical scenario with Germans going to Swiss, German-speaking cantons in Switzerland, or some other, or France and French-speaking canton in Switzerland. But the point is that these cap, the numbers, the percentage, which you say this becomes too challenging to democratic institution, it's not just about sovereignty and welfare state, but also to democratic institution is disputed. And I think what we are witnessing now is a kind of an historical experiment. And we don't know what will be the situation in Europe, but we already see the outcome, and they are not so encouraging.
Thank you.
That will conclude tonight's panel on the paradox of sovereignty and global migration. Before we break, I would just like to invite Lomax Turner up for a couple words.
I'm going to steal your term, agoraphobia. I'm going to steal this term.
Wow, that was an intense discussion. Hi everyone, I'm Lomax Turner and I'm a second-year student at Tufts. Learning about migration through experts and professionals in the format of a symposium is great for listening and learning. However, it isn't ideal for conversations, discussions, and for getting to know the experts in a more relaxed setting. This is why I invite all of you to come attend our expert-led small group discussion sessions tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. They will be held all over campus, all with differing topics and fields regarding migration. We are offering 7 discussion groups, and I'd love to highlight 2 of the discussions that I am most excited about. The breakout session on the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar will feature Mr. Charlie Carstens, who is currently engaged in Buddhist studies at Harvard. Through his expertise on identity politics, the breakout session will seek to understand the Rohingya crisis, the causes and repercussions of the discriminatory policies by the Burmese government, and the current state of refugees in the region. Mr. Carstens will be able to answer all questions about the Buddhist history in Myanmar and how it has manifested into a crisis. Another exciting breakout discussion will be led by Leila Abougheda, the Regional Director of the West Africa and Middle East Regional Office for FHI 360. She will zero in on both the exclusion and incorporation of migrants into development programs in West Africa through the lens of development, investment, and infrastructure. She will be able to answer questions regarding migrants' needs and the extent to which their needs have been met. Check your program for a list of all available discussions and their prospective locations. Thank you for your time, and I hope all of you had a lovely second day of the symposium. Take care, have a wonderful night, and I'll see you tomorrow.